Somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the grey light before dawn on June 6, 1944, a young man hit the ground hard. His parachute had barely opened. He had jumped from 300 feet instead of the planned 700, his transport plane screaming through anti-aircraft fire at 165 miles per hour. The jolt of landing cracked 3 vertebrae in his back and slammed his helmet into his skull hard enough to give him a concussion. His 125-pound bundle of medical supplies, everything he needed to save lives, had torn free in a gust of wind somewhere above and vanished into the darkness of occupied France. He had no rifle, he had no pistol, he carried no weapon of any kind. All he had was a canvas pouch with a few bandages, a handful of morphine syrettes, some packets of sulfanilamide powder, and a white armband stitched with a red cross. He was a combat medic, and in a few hours men would be screaming his name across the bloodiest battlefield of the 20th century. This is the story of the men who ran toward the gunfire, when every instinct screamed at them to run the other way. Men who carried no weapons into the worst killing fields of World War II. Men who crawled through minefields, waded through surf under machine gun fire, and dragged the wounded to safety with their bare hands. They were American combat medics. And in the crucible of that terrible war, they earned something that no medal or citation could fully capture. They earned the respect of the very soldiers trying to kill them. To understand how extraordinary that respect was, you first have to understand what a combat medic actually was. Before World War II, the United States Army had no real tradition of putting dedicated medical personnel into the front lines with rifle companies. Enlisted medical soldiers had mostly been hospital orderlies and litter bearers, men who worked well behind the fighting. But the explosion of mechanized warfare changed everything. Tanks, artillery, machine guns, and mortars could produce mass casualties in minutes. Wounded men who lay untreated in the open bled out and died. The army needed someone who could go forward with the infantry, who could stop the bleeding right there in the dirt and the chaos, and who could keep a dying man alive long enough to get him to a surgeon. That someone was the company aidman. The army built him from scratch at massive training centers across the United States. Camp Barkley in Texas was the largest. A 70,000-acre installation that eventually trained tens of thousands of enlisted medics and commissioned roughly 12,500 medical administrative officers through its officer candidate school. Before Pearl Harbor, the peacetime training cycle ran 13 weeks. After December 7, 1941, the desperate need for medics forced the Army to compress the program to just 8 weeks. As casualties mounted and the Army realized how much these men truly needed to know, the cycle was gradually expanded again, eventually reaching as long as 17 weeks by 1943. Trainees studied anatomy, physiology, map reading, sanitation, chemical warfare defense, and the Geneva Convention. They crawled through infiltration courses under live machine gun fire 30 inches above their backs. They carried litters through obstacle courses, learned to splint fractures in the dark, and practiced stopping arterial bleeding until the procedures were burned into their muscle memory. What they carried into battle was remarkably simple. 2 khaki canvas pouches hooked to a pistol belt held everything: field dressings, gauze bandages, and compresses of various sizes. Morphine tartrate syrettes, those small lead foil tubes with attached needles that became the iconic battlefield painkiller of the war. Each syrette held a half-grain dose, and medics were trained to pin the empty tube to the patient's collar so the next person who treated him would know how much morphine he had already received. Packets of sulfadiazine tablets and envelopes of sulfanilamide crystalline powder for sprinkling directly into open wounds to fight infection. A tourniquet, iodine swabs, bandage scissors. And after 1943, dried blood plasma that could be reconstituted with sterile water in the field. A revolutionary advancement that saved thousands of lives because it eliminated the need for blood type matching. That was it. No rifle, no pistol, no grenades. The company aidman went into battle armed with bandages and his bare hands. His only protection was a red cross painted on his helmet and a white armband with a red cross stitched onto it, issued by the War Department in accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1929. The medic's job was to keep a wounded man alive long enough to pass him down a chain of evacuation that stretched from the front line all the way back to a general hospital in England or North Africa. When a soldier went down, the aidman crawled to him, stopped the bleeding, sprinkled sulfur powder into the wound, applied a dressing, gave morphine if needed, and filled out an emergency medical tag. A small printed card tied to the patient on which he recorded the wound, the time, the dose of morphine, and the treatment given. Then the litter bearers came. 4 men per battalion were assigned as full-time bearers, but in heavy combat that number was never enough. They carried the wounded 500 to 1,000 yards back to a battalion aid station, a tent or a cellar staffed by a medical officer and a small enlisted detachment. From there, the patient went by jeep ambulance to a divisional clearing station 5 to 10 miles back, then to a portable surgical hospital, an evacuation hospital, or a general hospital further in the rear. A typical infantry battalion of 400 to 500 men had about 30 medics or aidmen. In prolonged combat, that number was whittled down to far fewer. It was an efficient system when it worked, but when the fighting was intense, when casualties came faster than they could be evacuated, the chain buckled, and it was the company aidman at the very front of that chain who bore the weight. He was the first set of trained hands to touch a dying man. Everything that followed depended on what he did in those first desperate minutes. The German medical system operated on similar principles, but with one critical difference. German medics were armed. Under Wehrmacht regulations, all military personnel were classified as combatants regardless of their role. German stretcher-bearers and medical non-commissioned officers carried pistols. Some even carried standard rifles. This created an asymmetry that shaped the entire dynamic of the Western Front. American medics were unarmed and therefore unambiguously non-combatant. German medics were armed and therefore occupied a more ambiguous position. For the Americans, that asymmetry amplified the moral weight of the Red Cross. An unarmed man running into gunfire to save lives carried a different kind of authority than a man with a pistol on his hip. And on the other side of the line, German soldiers recognized it. That convention, signed at Geneva on July 27, 1929, was supposed to protect him. It stated that medical personnel were to be respected and protected under all circumstances. They were not to be deliberately fired upon. They were not to be taken as prisoners of war but treated as retained personnel if captured. The Red Cross emblem was sacred, a symbol recognized by all civilized nations as meaning that the person wearing it was there to heal, not to harm. The reality on the battlefield was far more complicated. On the Western Front in Europe, the convention was largely respected by regular German Wehrmacht soldiers. American medics and infantrymen who survived the war described firefights that paused, while one side recovered wounded under a Red Cross flag. German military doctrine treated wounded enemy soldiers as patients rather than prisoners until they were medically stable. American prisoner of war doctors and captured German physicians sometimes worked alongside each other in field hospitals, freely teaching and learning different medical procedures from one another. Captured physicians on both sides were generally treated as respected colleagues. There was a kind of unspoken code among the men who fought on the Western Front, a thin thread of decency stretched across the horror. When a medic ran out into the open with his Red Cross visible, more often than not, the shooting would stop, at least for a moment, but that thread was easily broken. Waffen-SS units were notorious for ignoring the convention entirely. One account described an SS machine gunner who deliberately allowed a wounded American to lie crying in the open, waiting until a medic ran out under his Red Cross armband before cutting both men down with a long burst of fire. SS soldiers were known to use wounded men as bait, letting them scream to draw out the medics, then killing the rescuers along with the wounded. A medic who served with the 101st Airborne Division recalled being put on a medical train covered in Red Crosses heading to Reims, only to have it bombed and strafed. After incidents like these, many American medics smeared mud over the white circles on their helmets. The very symbol meant to protect them had become a target. In the Pacific Theater, the situation was even worse. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, but had never ratified it. Imperial Japanese forces operated under a battlefield doctrine that explicitly encouraged shooting medics, officers, and automatic riflemen as priority targets. American medics in the Pacific almost universally removed Red Cross markings from their helmets and aid station tents. Many carried carbines or pistols, rather than rely on a convention their enemy did not honor. As one famous medic would later put it, the Japanese were out to get the medics. To them, the most hated men in the American army were the medics and the automatic riflemen. They would let anybody else get by just to pick off the medics. The job was staggeringly dangerous regardless of the theatre. In companies that saw severe combat, it was not uncommon for every single company aidman to become a casualty. In the Hurtgen Forest, the regimental surgeon of the 16th Infantry Regiment reported that litter-bearers worked until they dropped from exhaustion, got 12 hours of rest, and then went right back out for another 72-hour shift. The 1st Infantry Division alone needed 240 emergency replacement litter-bearers during that campaign. The 68th Medical Group had to issue Red Cross armbands to 190 untrained infantry replacements pulled from depots and throw them onto the line as bearers because there was simply no one else left. And yet, despite all of this, despite the danger, the exhaustion, the horror of what they witnessed every single day, the medics kept going. They ran toward the screaming. They crawled through the mud. They dragged men twice their size through minefields and across open ground swept by machine gun fire, and they did it without firing a single shot in return. The places where their courage burned brightest read like a catalogue of the war's worst killing grounds. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. The first wave. Staff Sergeant Ray Lambert led a 30-man medical detachment of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Infantry Regiment onto Easy Red sector that morning. Lambert was already a Silver Star recipient for action in North Africa in 1943, where he had run through German lines to rescue trapped men. He had more citations from Sicily. He was a veteran. He knew what combat looked like. Nothing had prepared him for Omaha Beach. His landing craft took heavy fire on the run-in. Of the 31 soldiers aboard, only 7 survived the ramp dropping. As machine gun bullets cut down the men around him, Lambert raced back into the surf again and again, dragging wounded soldiers to a partial cover rock outcropping where he could work on them. He was wounded 3 separate times that morning, including a back injury when a landing craft ramp slammed down on him. He lost consciousness from blood loss while still standing in the shallow water. He woke up on the deck of an evacuation ship next to his brother Bill, who had been wounded in the same wave with the same regiment. Lambert is credited with saving more than 24 men in those few hours. That rock outcropping was later memorialized as Ray's Rock, now marked with a plaque dedicated by the village of Colleville-sur-Mer. Nearby on the same beach, a 19-year-old Penobscot tribal member from Indian Island, Maine, was having the worst morning of his life. Private Charles Norman Shay had been drafted in April 1943 and assigned to F Company of the same 16th Infantry Regiment. He landed on Easy Red in the first wave, waded through chest-deep water under machine gun fire, and immediately began pulling wounded men from the surf to keep them from drowning as the tide rose around them. One of his closest friends, Private Edward Morozowitz, suffered a wound that Shay could not treat with field equipment. Morozowitz died in Shay's arms on the beach. Shay earned the Silver Star for his actions that morning and later received the French Legion of Honor. He went on to fight at Aachen, the Hurtgen Forest, and the Battle of the Bulge. In March 1945, his squad was captured near the Sieg River, and force marched 60 miles to a German prisoner of war camp. He was liberated in April 1945. France dedicated a memorial park on Omaha Beach in his honor in 2017, also commemorating the 175 Native American soldiers who landed there. Shay moved to Normandy in 2018 and passed away there on December 3, 2025, at the age of 101. By most accounts, he was the last surviving medic of the first wave at Omaha Beach. On Dog Green sector, a few hundred yards down the same beach, the carnage was even worse. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, the National Guard unit known as the Bedford Boys, was being annihilated. Of approximately 130 men in the company, 91 were killed on D-Day itself. Cecil Breeden was one of the company's 3 aidmen and one of the few survivors. According to the eyewitness testimony of Private Harold Baumgarten, who had been transferred from Company A to Company B just 2 weeks before D-Day and had been shot through the upper jaw, Breeden moved among the bodies on the sand, checking each one, completely exposed to German fire. When he reached Baumgarten, Breeden knelt over him while shells fell nearby and forced him to take 12 sulfur tablets and water. When Baumgarten tried to pull Breeden down for cover, the medic slapped his hand away. "You are hurt now," Breeden told him. "When I get hurt, you can help me." Breeden also dragged wounded men out of the surf and concealed them behind beach obstacles to protect them from further fire. Baumgarten later wrote that Sergeant Breeden was probably the single greatest hero of D-Day and probably saved more lives than any other man that day. Breeden never sought recognition. He died in Arizona in 1991. Baumgarten and Breeden first met again in 1988, 44 years after the beach. They hugged, they cried, and they each said the same thing. "I thought you were dead." Staff Sergeant Bernie Friedenberg was another first-wave medic on Omaha Beach that morning, serving with the Medical Detachment, 1st Battalion, 16th Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. Friedenberg was a Jewish man who grew up in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He had been rejected by all three services for poor vision but persisted until he was accepted. On D-Day, Friedenberg walked into a German minefield 5 separate times under withering machine gun fire to retrieve wounded men, one at a time, carrying each one back to safety before going in again. He earned a Silver Star for that action alone. His daughter later documented an account in which he treated a wounded German soldier on the beach, telling him in Yiddish, "Never forget, a Jew saved you." Friedenberg saw North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the hedgerows, and the Bulge. He earned 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts across the entire war. He died on May 1, 2018, at the age of 96. A 6-foot bronze statue of Friedenberg, cradling a wounded soldier, was unveiled at a park in Atlantic City on the 80th anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 2024. But the most remarkable story of medics on D-Day did not happen on the beaches. It happened in a tiny village 5 kilometers inland from Utah Beach, in a 12th century stone church that still stands today. Privates Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore were medics with the 2nd Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. They jumped into Normandy at 01:25 on June 6, 1944. Wright was from Columbus, Ohio, born February 9, 1924. Moore was from Los Angeles, born November 5, 1924. Neither man had more than a few weeks of formal medical training beyond basic aid. They were paratroopers first, medics second, and they were about to do something that would be remembered for 80 years. In the chaos of the drop, scattered across the dark French countryside, the two medics found each other and made their way to the hamlet of Angoville-au-Plain, a village so small it barely registered on any map. They commandeered the ancient church of St. Cum and St. Damien, patron saints of physicians, and turned it into an aid station. They hung a hand-painted Red Cross sheet from the bell tower and began treating wounded, using a wheelbarrow to bring casualties in from the surrounding fields. Over the next 72 hours, the village changed hands multiple times as American paratroopers and German soldiers fought back and forth across the hedgerows. Wright and Moore stayed in the church the entire time. They treated everyone who was brought in, American, German, French civilian. They imposed only one rule. Anyone entering the church had to leave his weapon outside. And the Germans complied. When a German officer entered the church and saw that his own wounded soldiers were being treated alongside Americans and French civilians, he respected the building's neutrality. German soldiers helped carry their own wounded to the church on stretchers. At one point, a mortar round penetrated the church roof, cracked a flagstone in front of the altar, but did not detonate. 2 German marksmen who had been hiding in the church bell tower the entire time, unknown to the medics, eventually came down and surrendered. 2 American paratroopers died of their wounds in the church. The bloodstains remain visible on the wooden pews to this day. By June 8, Wright and Moore had treated approximately 80 wounded, including roughly a dozen Germans and local French girls caught in the crossfire. Both men received the Silver Star, presented at Carentan in late June 1944. Both went on to fight at Operation Market Garden in Holland and at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Wright died on December 21, 2013, at the age of 89. Some of his ashes are interred next to the church at Angoville-au-Plain. Moore worked for Chevron after the war and died on December 7, 2014, at the age of 90. The church now has 2 stained glass windows installed in their honor, and a stone monument in the village square reads, "In honor and in recognition of Robert E. Wright, Kenneth J. Moore." Medics, 2nd Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. for humane and life-saving care rendered to 80 combatants and a child in this church in June 1944. The Angoville story is powerful because it shows what was possible when the thin thread of decency held. But nowhere was that thread tested more severely than in the Hurtgen Forest. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest was the longest single battle the United States Army fought in Europe during World War II. It lasted from September 19, 1944 to December 16, 1944. 88 days of grinding, close-quarters combat in a dense forest along the German border. American First Army losses were at least 33,000 killed and wounded. German losses were approximately 28,000. The forest swallowed entire divisions. Trees shattered by artillery threw wooden splinters that acted like shrapnel. Minefields were everywhere. Visibility was sometimes measured in yards. And for the medics, it was a nightmare, unlike anything they had experienced even on Omaha Beach. It was also where some of the most extraordinary acts of cross-line humanity in the entire war took place. In early November 1944, units of the 28th Infantry Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard Division, known as the Bloody Bucket, were forced to retreat from the town of Schmidt across a narrow trail and bridge over the Kaul River. Hundreds of wounded American soldiers lay in the steep ravine, unable to be evacuated. German Captain Dr. Gunther Stuttgen, the regimental medical officer of the 980th Grenadier Regiment, walked unarmed under a Red Cross flag into American lines on November 7 to negotiate. His runner, Helmut Munster, later recalled the moment. Dr. Stuttgen, a medic and himself, identified by Red Cross signs on chest and back, wearing white armbands and being unarmed, proceeded on foot toward the American lines of defense. The Americans were surprised and kept them under close guard. After a brief conversation, their unit leader appeared and greeted them in German. 3 short ceasefires followed over the next 5 days. During those truces, German doctors and paramedics treated and evacuated wounded soldiers of both sides on and around the bridge. American sergeants volunteered as unarmed litter-bearers to bring their own wounded out. When a German sentry challenged one group of Americans and could not speak English, an American sergeant tried French, and the German became receptive. The lives of many American soldiers were saved by German medics during those ceasefires. After the war, the governor of Pennsylvania formally honored Dr. Stuttgen for his act of humanity. But the most haunting story from the Hurtgen Forest happened 5 days after the last of those ceasefires. On the morning of November 12, 1944, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld, a 23-year-old company commander in the 275th Infantry Division's Fusilier Battalion, was holding a position near the Forester's Lodge against the American 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division. His men could hear a wounded American soldier calling for help from inside a German anti-personnel minefield called the Wild Sow, meaning wild sow, in the no-man's land between the two lines. Lengfeld ordered his machine gunners not to fire if any American medics came to retrieve the wounded man. He waited. Hours passed. No one came. The American units had been pushed back too far to hear the cries. The wounded man kept calling. Finally, Lengfeld could not stand it anymore. He assembled his own paramedic squad, put on Red Cross vests, and led them down the road himself toward the wounded American. The road itself was clear of mines. Its locations were known, but as Lengfeld stepped off the road to reach the American soldier, he stepped on a concealed anti-personnel mine. The blast tore 2 coin-sized holes in his back. He was carried back to the casualty station at Freudsheim. He died that evening. He was 23 years old. The fate of the American soldier he tried to save is unknown to this day. Half a century later, in 1994, retired Major General John Ruggles, who had served as a lieutenant colonel with the 22nd Infantry Regiment during the Hurtgen fighting, led a group of American veterans back to Germany. They walked into the Hurtgen War Cemetery, the final resting place of over 2,900 German soldiers, and there, at the entrance, they erected a stone monument. It reads, in both English and German, "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy," in memory of Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld. Here in Hurtgen Forest on November 12, 1944, Lieutenant Lengfeld, a German officer, gave his life while trying to save the life of an American soldier lying severely wounded in the Wild Sow minefield and appealing for medical aid. It is believed to be the only monument anywhere in the world erected by American soldiers to honor a German soldier from World War II. The Hurtgen Forest was not the only place where the medical system was pushed to its breaking point. 6 weeks later, at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, the American medical infrastructure suffered a catastrophe that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. On the night of December 19–20, 1944, the 326th Airborne Medical Company, the 101st Airborne Division's primary clearing station, was set up at a crossroads near Hurtgen, about 8 miles northwest of Bastogne. Fast-moving German motorized columns overran the position in the darkness. 11 officers and 119 enlisted medics were captured in a single night. One man, Private Henry Sullivan, was killed. The loss gutted the division's medical capability at the exact moment when casualties were flooding in from every direction. What remained was almost nothing. 2 medical officers, 2 dental officers, 4 administrative officers, and roughly 113 enlisted men were all the 101st Airborne had left to handle the wounded. They set up improvised aid stations in any building that had 4 walls and a roof, basements, barns, a schoolhouse. In one aid station on the Rue Neufchâteau, an American Army doctor named Captain John Pryor worked alongside a Congolese-born Belgian nurse named Augusta Chiwi and a Belgian civilian nurse named Renée Lambert, who had come home to Bastogne to visit her parents and been trapped by the German offensive. Together they treated a flood of casualties with dwindling supplies, performing surgery by candlelight when the electricity failed. On Christmas Eve, around 8:30 in the evening, a German bomb made a direct hit on the aid station serving the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion. 30 wounded American soldiers were killed. Renée Lambert managed to evacuate 6 soldiers from the burning building, but died while attempting to save a 7th. Augusta Chiwi, who had been in a nearby building at the moment of impact, survived and continued working. From December 19 to 26, the besieged Bastogne medical teams treated 943 American casualties and 125 German prisoners with almost no supplies, no blood plasma, and no way to evacuate the critically wounded. Surgical teams finally arrived by glider on December 26 and 27. One surgeon performed 15 procedures in 36 straight hours. When the road into Bastogne was finally opened on December 27, 22 ambulances and 10 trucks evacuated all the wounded to safety. The Bastogne experience revealed something essential about medics. When the system collapsed around them, when the training manuals became useless and the supply chain ceased to exist, the medics improvised. They tore up bed sheets for bandages. They boiled water in kitchen pots to sterilize instruments. They kept men alive through sheer, stubborn refusal to let them die. And they did not distinguish between American wounded and German wounded. The 125 German prisoners treated at Bastogne received the same care as the 943 Americans. Not because there was a surplus of resources, there was not, but because the medics could not bring themselves to let a wounded man die untreated, regardless of the uniform he wore. While the Western Front produced these extraordinary moments of mutual respect, the Pacific Theater tested the limits of human courage in a different way entirely. And no man embodied that courage more completely than a skinny Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia, who refused to touch a weapon. Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919. Raised in a deeply religious household, he held unshakable convictions against killing and working on the Sabbath. When the United States entered the war, he was working at the Newport News Naval Shipyard and could have claimed a deferment. He refused. He wanted to serve. He just would not carry a gun. He called himself a conscientious cooperator rather than a conscientious objector. He volunteered to be a combat medic. The Army assigned him to Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. His fellow soldiers mocked him. They called him a coward. Officers tried to have him discharged for psychiatric reasons. One soldier threatened to kill him in combat. Doss endured it all and stayed. By the time the division reached the Pacific, he had already earned 2 Bronze Stars for valor at Guam and later in 1944. The men who had once despised him now trusted him with their lives. On Okinawa, the 77th Division was ordered to take the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot cliff with a 35-foot vertical overhang at the top that the soldiers nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese had honeycombed it with tunnels and fortified every approach. Company B climbed cargo nets to the summit on May 2, 1945. 3 days later, a massive Japanese counterattack drove the Americans back with approximately 75 casualties. Every man was ordered to retreat. Doss refused to leave. Alone on a contested ridge, swept by artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire, with Japanese soldiers in tunnels all around him, Doss worked for roughly 12 hours. He found wounded men one by one, dragged each one to the cliff edge, and lowered them on a rope-supported litter, using a knot he had taught himself, 35 feet down the face of the escarpment, to friendly hands below, one by one, for 12 hours, under direct enemy fire, without a weapon. The official estimate is that he saved 75 men that day. His commanders believed the real number was closer to 100. Doss himself insisted it could not have been more than 50. The army split the difference and put 75 on his Medal of Honor citation. Over the following weeks, Doss continued. On May 2, he crossed 200 yards of open ground under rifle and mortar fire to rescue a wounded man. On May 4, he advanced through grenades to within 8 yards of a Japanese cave to treat 4 men who had been cut down assaulting it, then made 4 trips under fire to evacuate them. On May 5, he administered plasma to a wounded artillery officer while shells exploded around them, then carried another man 100 yards to safety while completely exposed. On May 21, during a night attack near Shuri, a Japanese grenade landed near him. He tried to kick it away. The explosion drove 17 pieces of shrapnel into his legs. Doss treated his own wounds and waited 5 hours for litter bearers. When they arrived, he rolled off the litter and gave it to a man he judged more critically wounded than himself. While waiting for the bearers to return, a Japanese sniper's bullet shattered his left arm in a compound fracture. Doss lashed a rifle stock to his broken arm as a splint and crawled 300 yards to the aid station. He was evacuated aboard a hospital ship. He later contracted tuberculosis on later and ultimately lost a lung. On October 12, 1945, President Harry Truman presented him the Medal of Honor on the White House lawn, shook his hand, and kept holding it the entire time the citation was read aloud. Truman told him, "I am proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond Doss was the first conscientious objector ever to receive the Medal of Honor. He died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. Doss served in the Pacific, not against Germany. But his story belongs in any account of medics earning respect under fire because it illustrates the purest form of the same principle that German soldiers on the Western Front recognized, that there is something in the act of saving life under fire that transcends the hatred of war. The Japanese did not honor the Geneva Convention. They targeted medics deliberately. And yet Doss survived 12 hours alone on Hacksaw Ridge. His survival seemed, even to hardened combat veterans, to defy explanation. Back in Europe, other medics earned the highest honor the nation could bestow. Corporal Thomas Joseph Kelly of the 48th Armored Infantry Battalion, 7th Armored Division. He was born in Brooklyn in 1923 and had tried to enlist in the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor, but was rejected for poor vision. Drafted into the Army, he requested combat medic training. On April 5, 1945, near Alamert in the Ruhr Valley, Kelly's platoon was pinned down by machine gun and tank fire. After reaching safety with the uninjured survivors, Kelly turned around and crawled back into the kill zone. He dragged wounded men 300 yards to safety under direct machine gun fire. 2 volunteers who tried to help him were mortally wounded. Kelly dressed their wounds, carried them to safety, and went back. He saved 17 men in a single day and refused to stop until his platoon resumed its attack and took the objective. Kelly later recalled that by April 1945, many of the Germans facing him were young boys and old men with no medics of their own. Several of them surrendered directly to him because he carried no weapon. The Red Cross armband had become, by the war's end, not just a symbol of protection but a symbol of mercy. Technician, 5th grade Alfred Wilson, of the 328th Infantry Regiment, 26th Infantry Division, serving in Patton's Third Army, was wounded by artillery fire near Bastogne-la-Petite in the Lorraine region of France on November 8, 1944. He refused evacuation and continued treating his company's wounded, dragging himself from one casualty to the next as he slowly bled to death. When he became too weak to move, he verbally directed untrained enlisted men in administering first aid until he lost consciousness. He died of his wounds. His unit credited him with saving at least 10 men. He received a posthumous Medal of Honor. Technician 5th grade James Okubo was a Japanese-American Nisei medic with the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the all-Nisei unit that became the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. In late October 1944, near Bifontaine in northeastern France, Okubo crawled 150 yards to within 40 yards of German lines under grazing machine gun fire, treating 17 men under barrage. The next day, he treated 8 more. On November 4, he ran 75 yards under machine gun fire to evacuate a wounded man from a burning tank. His decoration was originally a Silver Star. In the late 1990s, Congress mandated a review of the records of Asian American Distinguished Service Cross recipients from World War II. Okubo's case was added to the review, and on June 21, 2000, President Bill Clinton presented him and 21 other Asian American soldiers with the Medal of Honor at the White House, most of them posthumously. It was a belated acknowledgement that racial prejudice had denied these men the recognition they had earned decades earlier. In all, 11 members of the United States Army Medical Department received the Medal of Honor during World War II. Many more received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Bronze Star. But the vast majority of medics who served received no recognition beyond the gratitude of the men they saved. They did their work in anonymity, under fire, without complaint, and without weapons. The psychological cost was enormous. Medics were among the most exposed soldiers on the battlefield, yet unlike infantrymen, they could not return fire. They experienced the visual and auditory horror of mass casualties at point-blank range. They held dying men in their arms and listened to them call for their mothers. They made instant decisions about who could be saved and who could not. They watched friends die, and then had to treat the next wounded man as though nothing had happened. The cry itself, that single word shouted across a battlefield, was the most emotionally charged sound any soldier could hear. Medic, sometimes just Doc. Cartoonist Bill Mauldin, himself a 45th Infantry Division veteran, called the medic the private soldier's family doctor. When that word rang out across a field of fire, every man who heard it knew what it meant. Someone was hit, someone was bleeding, someone was dying. And somewhere, a man with a red cross on his arm was about to stand up and run toward it. What the army called combat fatigue, what a later generation would name post-traumatic stress disorder, struck medics with devastating frequency. An estimated 40% of all United States medical discharges during the war were for psychiatric conditions. Many medics, including Doss, Lambert, Friedenberg, Shay, and dozens of others, refused for decades to discuss what they had seen. The German military recognized what these men had accomplished. After the war ended in May 1945, American surgical teams toured German army field hospitals in northern Italy. The Italian campaign had been a particularly brutal proving ground for American medical innovation. From Salerno in September 1943 through the Volturno, the Gustav Line, Anzio, Cassino, and the final push through the Po Valley, the United States Fifth Army Medical Service developed the most sophisticated forward surgical system of the war. In the 10th Mountain Division's assault on Riva Ridge in the Apennines in February 1945, veteran Dave Rankin recalled that his company went up the mountain with 5 or 6 medics instead of the usual one, a sign that commanders expected devastating casualties. Medics climbed vertical rock faces with litters strapped to their backs. The reports from those post-war hospital tours, preserved in the United States Army Medical Department's official history, quote, one American observer's summary of what he found. His reaction, he wrote, was not one of condemnation for the type of surgery and surgical care that the German soldier received. Rather, it was one of high praise for the excellence of the American medical service. To see and discuss the German wounded offered the contrast by which to bring into better view what had actually been accomplished in the American system. German captured doctors said the same thing from the other direction. They had been astonished by the speed of evacuation, the availability of penicillin and plasma, and the systematic use of forward surgical hospitals that the Americans had developed. And the numbers bore this out. The overall survival rate of American wounded who received medical care in World War II was 69.3%. That figure was unprecedented for the era. It reflected not only advances in medicine, the mass production of penicillin, the development of dried plasma, the use of sulfanilamide, but also the raw courage of the men who delivered that medicine under fire. Every percentage point in that survival rate represented hundreds of lives. And behind each of those lives stood a medic who had crawled through the mud to reach them. Today, the places where these men served have become places of memory. The church at Angoville-au-Plain still holds services. Visitors can still see the blood-stained pews, the cracked flagstone, and the stained glass windows honoring Wright and Moore. Ray's Rock on Omaha Beach still bears its plaque. The Charles Shay Memorial Park overlooks the sand where a 19-year-old Penobscot medic pulled drowning men from the surf. The bronze statue of Bernie Friedenberg stands in Atlantic City, a 6-foot figure of a medic cradling a wounded soldier, unveiled on the 80th anniversary of the day he walked into a minefield 5 times. The stone monument to Friedrich Lengfeld still stands at the entrance to the Hurtgen War Cemetery, placed there not by Germans, but by the Americans who had once been his enemies. And in the hills of Okinawa, the cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge still drops 35 feet to the ground, where Desmond lowered 75 men to safety with a rope and a prayer. These men did not fight wars. They fought death itself. They carried no rifles, threw no grenades, and fired no shots. They carried bandages, morphine, sulfanilamide powder, and a Red Cross armband that was supposed to protect them and sometimes did not. They ran toward the sound of screaming when every survival instinct in the human body demanded retreat. They treated enemy wounded alongside their own, not because regulations required it, but because that is what healers do. The German soldiers who faced them across the hedgerows and the forest clearings and the frozen fields of the Ardennes recognized something in these unarmed men that transcended nationality and ideology. They saw courage without aggression, sacrifice without hatred, duty without the power to do harm. And in the middle of the most destructive war in human history, enough of them chose to honor that. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough and deeply enough that the stories survived. Often enough that American veterans walked into a German cemetery 50 years later to honor a German lieutenant who had died trying to reach one of their own. The combat medics of World War II earned their place in history not by the enemies they defeated, but by the lives they saved. They remind us that even in the darkest chapters of human conflict, even when civilizations are bent on destroying each other, there remains a space where mercy can exist. A space where a man with a red cross on his arm can walk into a minefield, or a burning church, or a blood-soaked beach, and do the only thing he knows how to do: save lives. That is what they did. That is who they were. And that is why, 80 years later, their story still matters.